Tonight, while most people scroll past blood moon alerts and go back to sleep, something measurable is occurring in the deep center of your brain, a cascade of chemistry, electromagnetic response, a neurological shift that ancient seers mapped in precise detail, and modern science is only now fully documenting. This is not about ritual, it is not about belief, it is about biology. The pineal gland, a photosensitive endocrine structure at the geometric center of your brain, is responding to the altered light and electromagnetic conditions of this eclipse right now. That response is documented. The question is not whether it's happening. The question is whether you are conscious of it, because the same event unfolds entirely differently in people who know nothing about it and people who have learned to receive what it opens. There are two versions of the blood moon that people encounter. The first is the version most people receive. The photographs, the posts about energy, the vague suggestions to set intentions under the red moon. This version is not false. It stops at the surface and never reaches the mechanism beneath. The second version is the one this video describes, a documented sequence of physiological changes that unfold in human consciousness during a total lunar eclipse, traceable through neuroscience, geophysics, and the preserved records of ancient traditions that spent centuries mapping the same effects. These two versions are not equally powerful. One produces occasional emotional resonance. The other produces transformation because it understands what is actually happening and engages with it accordingly. The gap between them is not intelligence, it is information. The observation that blood moons affect human consciousness is not a modern discovery. The Egyptians noted heightened perception and altered states during total lunar eclipses and incorporated these windows into temple practices. Maya astronomers embedded eclipse predictions into the Dresden Codex with accuracy within hours of modern calculations, not as abstract astronomical exercise, but because the effects on human consciousness during these windows were predictable enough to track across generations. The Vedic tradition prescribed specific meditation intensives during lunar eclipse windows. Tibetan monks documented deeper meditative states during particular lunar phases. Across multiple civilizations, without communication between them, the same observation accumulated. Something specific and repeatable happens to human awareness during a blood moon. None of these cultures had the vocabulary of neuroscience. They had the observed effects, which is where science itself always begins. Before we go deeper into the mechanism, if this kind of knowledge speaks to you, the real science underneath the spiritual, the mechanism beneath the tradition, subscribe to this channel. This is where we keep building on this work together. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Begin with the structure at the center of this discussion. What exactly is the pineal gland, and why does it matter specifically during a blood moon? The pineal gland is a small, photosensitive endocrine gland located at the geometric center of the human brain. Its name derived from its pine cone shape. It is the primary producer of melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep, circadian rhythms, and brainwave transitions. Unlike most brain structures, the pineal is not protected by the blood-brain barrier. It responds directly to light signals, traveling from the retina via a dedicated neural pathway, triggering or suppressing melatonin production based on light intensity and spectral composition. In 1649, Descartes named it the seat of the soul. And the structural detail he was responding to was that it is the only unpaired structure in the brain. Every other structure is bilateral. The pineal stands alone at the center. Darkness arrives. The pineal gland activates. Melatonin floods the bloodstream. Brainwave activity shifts from beta, the alert, problem-solving frequency of ordinary waking consciousness, into alpha, and then into theta. Theta is the state associated with meditation, deep creative insight, and the dissolution of the boundary between conscious and unconscious processing. This is documented EEG data, replicated across thousands of sleep and meditation studies. The blood moon does something specific to this sequence. It does not produce ordinary darkness. It produces altered darkness, a dramatic shift in spectral composition, with red wavelengths dominating and total brightness, dropping by more than 100-fold compared to an ordinary full moon. The pineal gland registers this spectral shift as distinct from standard nighttime darkness. The melatonin cascade begins. The neurological sequence follows. If you are in the blood moon window right now, your pineal gland has already begun adjusting melatonin production. You may not feel it as a chemical event. You feel it as something else. A slight difficulty concentrating on ordinary things, a pull toward quiet, a quality of awareness that feels different from a regular evening. You may have felt earlier tonight an emotional charge without obvious cause, something pressing toward the surface without a clear name. That is not placebo. That is melatonin chemistry responding to the specific spectral conditions of the eclipse, shifting your brainwave state toward theta, opening access to material that ordinary daylight keeps below the threshold of awareness. You may have told yourself you were just tired. You were in a neurologically distinct state. Those are not the same thing. Descartes described the pineal gland as the seat of the soul in his 1649 work, The Passions of the Soul. Modern neuroscience classifies it as a neuroendocrine transducer, a structure that converts environmental light signals into hormonal signals regulating biological rhythms. These two descriptions appear to be saying entirely different things. Placed beside each other, they are not in contradiction. They are describing the same observation from opposite ends of 5 centuries. Both are mapping the same fact, that the pineal gland is the site where the external light environment is translated into the internal landscape of consciousness. Descartes lacked endocrinology. The neuroendocrinologist lacks the philosophical framework Descartes was reaching toward. What they describe together is more complete than what either describes alone. The shift into theta brainwaves during elevated melatonin states has been studied extensively. Theta oscillations, 4 to 8 cycles per second, are associated with increased creativity, enhanced pattern recognition, reduced cognitive suppression, and heightened access to emotional memory. Meditators who train for years to achieve theta on demand are reaching the same neurological condition that the blood moon induces through the pineal melatonin pathway without requiring practice. Ancient practitioners who noted heightened intuition and unusual perception during lunar eclipse periods were describing theta activity in whatever vocabulary was available to them. The Egyptians called this the opening of the eye. The Vedic tradition called the associated process pratyahara, withdrawal from external processing toward heightened internal perception. Different traditions, different terminologies, identical neurological mechanism. The rational mind runs on beta waves. It needs beta to function, to assess, filter, suppress, decide. Beta is the frequency of management. It keeps the foreground of awareness clear by keeping the background suppressed. Shadow material, unprocessed emotional content, memories and patterns that don't fit the self-narrative the conscious mind maintains, lives below the threshold that beta supports. Blood moon arrives, melatonin rises, beta drops, theta opens. The material that beta was holding at a distance begins to rise, not as threat, as access. This explains why people experience more during a blood moon, not because something is being added from outside, but because something that was already present is becoming visible. The eclipse does not import material into your consciousness. It reduces the suppression structure that was keeping existing material out of view. If what we've covered so far is reshaping how you understand these windows, write in the comments, "I am in the window." Now, what if the blood moon effect is not only about light? What if there is a second layer of mechanism operating simultaneously with the pineal pathway that most discussions never mention? In 1992, Dr. Joseph Kirschvink at the California Institute of Technology published a finding that changed the conversation about human biology and magnetic fields. Human brain tissue contains magnetite crystals, the same biological mineral used by migratory birds to navigate the Earth's geomagnetic field. The concentration is significant, approximately 5 million magnetite crystals per gram of tissue in the cerebellum and brainstem. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It is not fringe research, and it means one precise thing. During a blood moon, your brain is not only registering altered light, it is registering altered magnetic fields. Ancient Egyptians constructed the Great Pyramid with its king's chamber oriented to magnetic north with a precision that continues to draw attention from engineers and archaeoastronomers. Whether this was intentional consciousness technology remains debated. What is not debated is that the magnetite discovery was made thousands of years after the pyramid was built, meaning whoever made that orientation decision had no vocabulary for magnetoreception. What they had was observation, that specific architectural conditions, aligned with specific astronomical conditions, produced specific effects in human consciousness. The Vedic tradition mapped its sacred sites along corridors of geomagnetic intensity. The Maya aligned their observatories in ways that went beyond visual astronomy. In each case, the pattern is the same. Magnetic field sensitivity was being mapped empirically, centuries before the physics was available to explain it. Your brain is literally magnetic, not as a metaphor, not as an energetic concept, literally. It contains the same crystalline mineral structure that allows birds to navigate continents using the planet's geomagnetic field. When that field fluctuates, as it does during a total lunar eclipse, when the orbital geometry of Earth, Moon and Sun produces specific changes in how the solar wind interacts with Earth's magnetosphere, your brain registers the change. This is not belief. The magnetite is there. The field changes are measurable with magnetometers. The only open question is the degree to which this registration reaches conscious awareness in any given individual. In elevated theta states, which the blood moon window produces, the threshold of awareness may be lower. You are magnetic. The field is shifting. Both of these are happening now. The geomagnetic changes during a total lunar eclipse are measurable and documented. The moon's gravitational influence on Earth's magnetosphere produces specific fluctuations in field intensity. Research by Neil Cherry at Lincoln University documented correlations between geomagnetic fluctuations and human biological rhythms, including measurable changes in melatonin production, cortisol levels, and brainwave activity. The Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic resonance frequency of the Earth's ionosphere surface cavity, responds to changes in ionospheric conditions that vary with lunar positioning. When the Schumann resonance shifts, human brainwave entrainment has been observed to shift with it. The second layer of the blood-moon mechanism is not subtle. It is planetary electromagnetic activity, measurable with instruments, and your brain contains the biological hardware to receive it. Two mechanisms operating simultaneously, neither requiring belief to function. Light changes, pineal activates, melatonin rises, theta opens, geomagnetic field shifts, magnetite crystals register the change, biological rhythms adjust, a second layer of sensitivity compounds the first. These are not parallel metaphors. These are two documented biological pathways, each triggered by physically measurable aspects of the blood moon, each producing documented neurological effects. The combination of both pathways, operating simultaneously, creates a compound neurological event that does not occur under ordinary conditions. You can believe this or not. The pineal gland does not ask for your belief before producing melatonin. The magnetite crystals do not consult your spiritual framework before registering field changes. The mechanisms operate regardless. The only variable is whether you are conscious of what they produce. The standard narrative has it backwards. Ancient traditions are described as spiritual, meaning pre-scientific, faith-based, intuitive. Modern science is the corrective, the tool that strips away superstition and finds the real mechanism underneath. Apply this to the blood moon documentation and the narrative inverts completely. Ancient practitioners were the first empiricists here. They observed that human consciousness changed during blood moons, tracked those changes across centuries, developed systematic practices in response, and left documentation across multiple independent civilizations. They didn't have the vocabulary of melatonin, magnetite, or theta waves. They had the observation, across thousands of nights, that something specific and reproducible happened to human awareness during a blood moon. Science is now naming the mechanism underneath the observation they made first. The tradition was not pre-scientific speculation, it was empirical observation awaiting a vocabulary. If this content is speaking to you, if the mechanism beneath the tradition is landing the way it's meant to, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this work at the right moment. The third layer of the blood moon effect on consciousness is psychological, and it is the layer most people experience most directly, even without a framework for understanding what is happening. The human psychological system runs in ordinary waking life with a specific structure in place. The rational mind, associated with left hemisphere dominance, analytical processing, beta brainwave activity, and prefrontal cortical filtering, manages the foreground of awareness. This management function is adaptive. It keeps social functioning intact, maintains the self-narrative, filters out material that would disrupt forward momentum. But the same function that keeps ordinary life operational also suppresses what has been called, across traditions, the shadow, the unconscious, the underworld, the duat. During a blood moon, the management structure holding this material below the threshold of conscious awareness is temporarily disrupted. The material rises. Something loosens during a blood moon, not dramatically, more like pressure releasing from something held tightly closed. The thoughts that surface are not random. They are the thoughts that ordinary daylight keeps at bay, the emotions without obvious cause, the memories without clear trigger, the clarity about something you've been avoiding, arriving not with fanfare but with quiet certainty that cuts through noise, the anxiety that exceeds its apparent object. If you have experienced any of these during this blood moon window, you are not malfunctioning. The rational mind's grip was loosening as the eclipse chemistry loosened it, and the material it normally manages was becoming accessible. The tradition calls this shadow emergence. Neuroscience calls it reduced prefrontal gating. Whatever label you use, the access is real, and what you do with it determines what this window produces. Carl Jung formalized the concept of the shadow in the 20th century, the psychological contents excluded from the conscious personality's self-definition, not because they are dangerous, but because they are incompatible with the current version of identity the person maintains. He observed that suppressed contents accumulate energy and find expression through indirect channels, projection, compulsive behavior, sudden emotional floods. He noted that specific conditions could make the shadow accessible, conditions involving reduced rational control and what he called numinous experience. But the observation of shadow emergence during eclipse periods predates Jung by millennia. The Egyptian Book of the Dead maps the encounter with shadow material as the central trial of the soul in the duat. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol describes an equivalent process. The Orphic tradition mapped it as descent to Hades. Jung named what practitioners across civilizations had been tracking for thousands of years. Why does the blood moon specifically produce this loosening of rational suppression, rather than intensifying it the way ordinary stress does? The mechanism is the key. Ordinary stress produces cortisol, activates the fight-flight response, increases beta activity and prefrontal dominance. Suppression tightens. The blood moon operates through the melatonin pathway, which works opposite to the stress response. Melatonin has documented anxiolytic effects at the neurological level. It reduces stress hormone activity rather than amplifying it. The blood moon produces the neurological equivalent of deep relaxation combined with heightened sensitivity. Not tense alertness, but receptive openness. In that specific state, the prefrontal filter relaxes rather than tightening. The material below the threshold rises not in explosion, but in tide. This is why the blood moon produces insight rather than threat, when the framework for receiving it is in place. Here is where the language becomes precise. English calls it the unconscious, as if it is something dormant, inactive, absent, a thing not present. Ancient Egyptian psychology used the word duat. Translators render it underworld, but the word itself carries a different meaning, that which exists but is not visible, not absent, present but invisible. That distinction changes everything. In the Egyptian frame, the unconscious is not something you lack access to. It is something you are not currently looking at. The blood moon shifts the light. The orientation that has been keeping the duat invisible temporarily fails. You are not gaining access to something foreign. You are losing the ability to ignore what was already there. The difference is not semantic. It determines whether shadow material surfacing during this window feels like threat or like information. The blood moon does not create your shadow material. This distinction requires emphasis. People experiencing emotional intensity during a blood moon often interpret it as evidence that something is wrong, that the blood moon is disturbing them, producing negativity where none existed. The correct interpretation is opposite. The material was already there. The sadness, the unresolved pattern, the clarity about something you've been refusing to see. The blood moon did not produce any of it. It produced the conditions under which material already present became accessible. The difficulty is not evidence of harm. It is evidence of access. This reframing is not psychological comfort. It is the accurate description of the mechanism. And accurate description is what makes the difference between being overwhelmed by shadow emergence and using it for the integration it offers. If you've been studying this kind of material, the real mechanism beneath the tradition, but still feel like something keeps blocking your ability to actually use it during these windows, like the understanding doesn't quite bridge into practice. I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to move from understanding to application. Before the quantum layer, the most speculative but also the most consequential, one honest acknowledgement is necessary. What follows includes established physics, applied in ways that are not yet confirmed at the human scale. The observer effect is settled science at the subatomic level. Its extension to human consciousness at macroscopic scale is a philosophical debate, not consensus. The Hermetic tradition treats the relationship between consciousness and reality as established. Some interpretations of quantum neuroscience, particularly Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory, treat it as a serious scientific hypothesis. Neither can be claimed with equal certainty, and this video won't claim them that way. What it will do is present the evidence clearly enough for you to assess it yourself. That precision is not weakness. It distinguishes this work from content that asks you to believe without understanding. The observer effect was established through the double-slit experiment and formalized through the work of physicists including Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and Max Born in the early 20th century. The finding was stark. At the quantum scale, particles exist in a superposition of possible states until observation, at which point the wave function collapses and a single outcome becomes definite. The role of the observer was not incidental, it was structural. The Copenhagen interpretation, the most widely taught framework in physics, holds that observation, the act of measurement, is what produces definite reality from probability. Physicists who followed, including Eugene Wigner, extended this further. Some interpretations hold that consciousness itself performs this observational function. This is not fringe speculation. Wigner's friend-thought experiment remains a live discussion in Quantum Foundation's research. Does the observer effect apply to human consciousness at scales relevant to daily experience? The honest scientific answer: the question is not settled and is actively researched. Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory proposes that quantum coherence operates in neural microtubules, structural proteins inside neurons, and that this quantum processing underlies conscious experience. The theory is controversial, contested, and in early stages of empirical testing. What it takes seriously is the question of whether the human brain operates as a quantum system, and if it does, what this implies for the observer effect at neurological scale. Whether the theory is confirmed is secondary to the question it raises. If the brain is a quantum system, and the observer effect applies at the quantum level, then the state of consciousness and the collapse of probability from possible to actual are not unrelated events. The hermetic answer to that question, the relationship between the state of consciousness and the structure of experience, is direct, not metaphorical. A consciousness in theta state, elevated melatonin, reduced suppression, electromagnetic sensitivity, heightened shadow material accessible, is not the same observer as a consciousness in routine beta, distracted, filtered, managed. Different consciousness states, different observers. If the observer determines what collapses from probability into outcome, a changed observer produces a changed field of possible outcomes. The blood moon does not guarantee specific results. It does not override agency. But if what tradition and quantum theory together suggest is accurate, that the relationship between the observer's state and what is observed is not neutral, then the altered consciousness produced by the blood moon is also an altered relationship to what is possible in the hours and days that follow. The three-layer convergence is now fully visible. At the neurological scale, the pineal gland responds to altered light. Melatonin rises, theta opens, shadow material surfaces. At the electromagnetic scale, magnetite crystals in brain tissue register geomagnetic fluctuations associated with the eclipse, adding a second biological pathway that compounds the first. At the quantum theoretical scale, if consciousness functions as the observer in the quantum mechanical sense, the altered state produced by the blood moon is also an altered observer, with implications for what collapses from probability into outcome. These three layers are not three separate arguments for the same claim. They are three scales of description for a single event. Ancient traditions that described the blood moon as a thinning of the veil were mapping all three layers simultaneously, without the vocabulary to separate them into disciplines. The mystery schools of antiquity structured their initiatory processes around this exact recognition. The Eleusinian mysteries at Eleusis in Greece, the most extensively documented of the ancient mystery schools, used specific altered conditions, including sensory shifts and astronomical timing, to produce states of consciousness in initiates that the tradition claimed were qualitatively distinct from ordinary experience. Hermetic schools documented 7 levels of initiation, each corresponding to a different degree of what they called gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the relationship between consciousness and reality. The foundational principle of the Kybalion, the all is mind, the universe is mental, is not a metaphysical claim about what matter is made of. It is a claim about the relationship between the state of consciousness and the structure of what is experienced. The blood moon is a naturally occurring initiatory window. The schools were using what already existed. You are now in that window, not because you performed a ritual, not because you found the right protocol, because the blood moon produces specific conditions in your nervous system, neurological, electromagnetic, and possibly quantum. And those conditions are active whether you know about them or not. The pineal gland produces melatonin. The magnetite crystals register field shifts. The theta state opens. These are not optional processes. They are happening. The only variable you control is whether you are conscious of them. And consciousness of a process changes the process, not through magic, but because directed attention is itself a neurological event, altering which circuits activate, which thresholds lower, which material is received, and which is bypassed. The window is already open. What you do inside it is the question that remains. Does the blood moon affect everyone equally, or does it affect some people more than others? Both things are true on different levels. Physiologically, every human nervous system with a functional pineal gland responds to the altered light conditions of a lunar eclipse. The melatonin pathway activates universally. The magnetite crystal response operates in every brain that carries the standard mineral complement. In this physiological sense, the blood moon is not selective, but the degree to which these changes reach conscious awareness, the degree to which the theta state is experienced, the shadow material is received, the electromagnetic sensitivity is felt, varies significantly with prior cultivation through contemplative practice, the quantity of shadow material accumulated and awaiting integration, and whether the person is engaged or passive in their relationship to the window. The mechanism is universal. The harvest is not. Listen to what most blood moon content does not say. Most discussions stop at "the energy is heightened" or "set your intentions." Neither statement is wrong. Both are incomplete. What they miss is this. The heightened state has a specific neurological substrate: melatonin chemistry, theta brainwaves, magnetite resonance. The intentions you set are processed by a brain in theta, with reduced suppression, with shadow material surfacing, with electromagnetic sensitivity elevated. Theta state processing has different properties than beta state processing. What you direct your attention toward during theta accesses the limbic system and emotional memory systems more directly, the parts of the brain that generate persistent patterns of behavior and expectation. Intention setting during a blood moon is not ritual. It is cognitive targeting during a period of documented neurological access. The two descriptions are the same activity. There is a dimension of the pineal gland's capacity that has entered serious scientific discussion but has not reached consensus. The gland is one of the few brain structures known to synthesize tryptamine compounds. Rick Strassman, a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico, conducted government-approved research on DMT's effects in humans in the 1990s and proposed that the pineal gland may produce endogenous DMT under specific physiological conditions, including deep dream states and near-death experiences. Subsequent research identified the enzymatic pathways for DMT synthesis in rodent pineal tissue. Whether this process occurs in human pineal tissue at psychoactively relevant levels remains unconfirmed and actively researched. What Strassman proposed, and what ancient descriptions of the pineal as a site of profound consciousness shifts may have been tracking empirically, is that the gland's full capacity extends beyond the documented melatonin function. The practical implication of everything described so far is this: if you want to work with the blood moon window at the level of the mechanism, the starting point is understanding what each mechanism requires. Theta brainwaves deepen with stillness and are inhibited by stimulation. Melatonin production is supported by darkness and disrupted by artificial blue light from screens. Magnetite resonance is sensitive to artificial electromagnetic pollution, Wi-Fi, phone radiation, Bluetooth, which overlays the natural geomagnetic signal with noise. Shadow material integration requires receptive attention without immediate judgment. These are not spiritual prescriptions. They are the practical implications of the documented mechanisms. Tibetan monks tracking lunar phases for intensive practice were applying a millennium of empirical observation about which conditions produce the deepest access. The prescriptions were engineering, not ritual. The Vedic tradition developed an extensive mapping of lunar influence on consciousness across centuries of systematic observation. The Jyotish system distinguishes between ordinary full moons and lunar eclipses, treating the latter as windows of intensified effect on mind and nervous system. Lunar eclipses in the Vedic tradition are called Chandra Grahan, literally lunar seizure or lunar grasp, a name acknowledging the intensity of the influence rather than softening it. The prescription was not to protect oneself from this influence, but to use it deliberately. Meditation intensives, mantra practices, fasting, and deliberate contemplative activity during the eclipse window. The word grahan, seizure, grasp, implies that something is taking hold of consciousness during the eclipse. In the Vedic frame, this was not threat. It was access, a grip that, if directed rather than resisted, produced specific and repeatable results. The anxiety that arises during a blood moon, the vague unease, the sense that something is pressing on the edges of awareness without being fully visible, is shadow material making itself known. That anxiety is not a symptom. It is the pressure of content held below the threshold of consciousness, reaching toward the awareness line that the blood moon has temporarily lowered. Two responses are possible. The first, suppress it, distract from it, override it with screens and noise, and let the window close, having accessed nothing. The second, sit with it, turn toward it, ask what it carries. Not all of it needs immediate action. Some of it needs only to be seen. The fact that shadow content surfaces during a blood moon does not demand immediate resolution. Sometimes the integration is completed simply by acknowledgement, by letting what was invisible be seen. What does it mean, practically, to work with the blood moon window at the level of all three mechanisms simultaneously? At the level of the neurological mechanism, minimize artificial light and screen stimulation. Allow theta to deepen, sit in deliberate stillness during the eclipse window. At the level of the electromagnetic mechanism, reduce artificial electromagnetic noise where possible, move away from concentrations of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and allow the natural geomagnetic signal to operate without overlay. At the level of the psychological mechanism, do not override what surfaces. Write it down, receive it as information. Apply no immediate judgment. Notice the quality of what arrives rather than rushing to explain or eliminate it. These instructions require no special equipment, no ceremony, no prior experience. They require only the decision to be present for what the blood moon window opens. 3 layers. 3 practical responses. Neural, sit in near darkness away from screens for the duration of the eclipse. Allow the melatonin to rise. Allow the theta to open without interruption. Electromagnetic, step outside if possible, not as ritual, but as physics. The geomagnetic signal registers more cleanly outdoors, without concrete and metal interference. Psychological, keep a notebook. Not for journaling in the therapeutic sense, for recording what arrives. Shadow material that surfaces during high-access windows and is not captured tends to dissipate when the window closes, leaving only residue of anxiety without the insight. Write what comes. The writing is the anchor. These are basic applications of documented mechanisms. The blood moon is doing the heavy neurological lifting. Your only task is to not obstruct the process with noise, light, and deliberate distraction. Distraction during a blood moon window is not a neutral choice. Artificial blue light from screens suppresses melatonin production. This is a documented function of blue spectrum light on the pineal melatonin pathway. Social media during this window is not simply leisure activity. It is a direct physiological interference with the neurological mechanism the eclipse is opening. Filling the window with noise, passive entertainment, surface conversation, stimulation of any kind is functionally equivalent to having a rare and time-limited access window to a specific neurological state, and then spending it deliberately preventing the state from forming. The window is available to every human nervous system. The mechanisms operate universally, but the person who sleeps through the window, neurologically, not literally, wakes the next day unchanged. The person who stays present for it wakes having processed something that won't come around again for months. The Aztec and Maya calendar systems are often described as sophisticated astronomy. That description is accurate but insufficient. The Dresden Codex eclipse prediction tables are accurate to within hours of modern astronomical calculations, generated without telescopes or electronic instruments. Neither culture tracked eclipses for abstract astronomical curiosity. The calendrical precision served a specific applied purpose. Knowing when the eclipse windows would occur allowed systematic preparation. Individuals and communities could be prepared in states of specific psychological readiness, in specific practical conditions that the tradition had empirically determined produced results during eclipse windows. The calendar was not just an astronomical instrument. It was a scheduling system for conscious engagement with astronomically determined windows of heightened neurological access. The precision of the calendar was the evidence of how seriously the observable effects had been taken. The question people ask about blood moon practices is usually framed as, will this work? The more accurate question is this already working? And am I positioned to receive what it produces? The blood moon does not require your participation to affect your biology. The pineal gland does not ask permission. The theta state opens whether you set an intention or watch television. Shadow material surfaces whether you are prepared for it or caught completely off guard. What changes with conscious engagement is not whether the mechanisms operate. They always operate. What changes is whether you extract something from them. The person who knows their theta state is elevated right now and uses that state for deliberate attention produces different results from the person in the same physiological state who is scrolling. Same window, same mechanisms, opposite outcomes. The Kalachakra Tantra, one of the most complex texts in Tibetan Buddhist tradition, mapping what translates as the Wheel of Time, builds an explicit relationship between astronomical cycles and states of consciousness. The Kalachakra system maps correlations between celestial events and the inner Kalachakra, the internal cycles of the human nervous system. Lunar eclipses occupy a specific position in this mapping, periods when the relationship between the outer astronomical event and the inner neurological state is at maximum correlation. The tradition prescribes specific practices timed to these windows, not as arbitrary ritual, but as applied technology, scheduling high-leverage interventions to coincide with the periods when the internal system is most receptive. This is not mysticism dressed in astronomical imagery. It is a systematic practice framework built on centuries of empirical observation about what happens to human consciousness during lunar eclipses. Whatever brought you here tonight, the search, the recommendation, the timing that feels less random than the algorithm, the material that has been moving toward the surface in you during this window was already in motion before you found this content. the thoughts you didn't quite invite, the emotional charge that preceded this video, the quality of this evening that felt different from an ordinary one. This content does not produce that experience. It provides a framework for what you are already experiencing. The frameworks that ancient traditions built and that neuroscience is confirming do not generate the neurological event. They explain what the event is, and explanation, arriving in the right moment, is the thing that transforms confusion into access. The window was open before you came here. It remains open now. How long does the blood moon window remain active? The period of totality lasts hours, but the neurological and electromagnetic effects are not confined to visible totality. Melatonin chemistry takes hours to return to baseline after the pineal gland's activation peak. The geomagnetic fluctuations associated with the eclipse extend somewhat beyond the moment of maximum alignment. Ancient traditions, Vedic, Tibetan, Egyptian, typically worked a 24 to 72-hour window around major lunar events, not just the event itself. Modern measurements of geomagnetic variability during lunar events support a similar extended time frame. The window does not snap closed when the eclipse ends. What closes is the period of maximum intensity, the peak activation of all three mechanisms simultaneously. But the elevated state persists at decreasing intensity for the hours that follow. You have more time than the visible event suggests. Whatever time remains in this window, the question is not whether you have used it correctly so far. The question is what you do with what remains. An hour of deliberate receptivity during a blood moon peak is not less valuable than 3 hours. An hour of sitting with shadow material, receiving it without suppression, writing what it carries, allowing the theta state to do what theta states do, can produce movement on something that has been locked for months. The mechanisms do not require extended sessions. They require presence. The theta window is currently available. The shadow material that was already surfacing will continue to surface until the window closes. Your task right now is not to design the perfect practice. Your task is to stop producing reasons why this isn't the right moment. Two kinds of people move through a blood moon. The first group, they feel the unusual weight of the window, the quality of awareness that differs from an ordinary evening, the material pressing against the edges of consciousness, and they override it. They scroll. They explain to themselves that it was a long week. They wake the next morning unchanged, the window closed without producing anything. The second group, they recognize what is happening, or they don't have the vocabulary, but they honor the feeling anyway. And they stay present. They sit with the dark. They write down what surfaces. They allow the anxiety to speak rather than overriding it. They wake the next morning having processed something. The difference between these two groups is not intelligence, not spiritual development, not luck. It is the willingness to remain conscious during a window that every available piece of evidence, ancient and modern, says matters. The convergence of neuroscience, geophysics, and ancient observational tradition on the blood moon's effects on consciousness is not a call to ritual. It is a call to informed presence. You do not need a ceremony for the pineal gland to respond to altered light. You do not need a spiritual framework for magnetite crystals to register geomagnetic fluctuations. You do not need to believe in the Hermetic tradition for the shadow material loosened by theta to become accessible. What the tradition adds, what the ancient mapping adds, is the framework for receiving what the biology opens. Without the framework, shadow material surfacing during a blood moon produces anxiety. With the framework, the same material produces insight. The biology is already happening. The only question is whether you have a container for what it delivers. The ancient Greek mystery schools practiced a ritual called katabasis, a deliberate descent into what they called the underworld, conducted for the explicit purpose of transformation and return. The Eleusinian mysteries used specific initiatory conditions, including altered states and astronomical timing, to produce this descent in prepared initiates. The descent was not metaphorical. It was a structured process involving confrontation with shadow material and the systematic dissolution of ordinary ego consciousness. Initiates who completed catabasis did not emerge simply shaken. They emerged reorganized. What they brought back was not memory of the underworld, but a changed relationship to it. The shadow, encountered directly rather than managed from a distance, lost its power to operate unconsciously. It became material to work with, rather than a force working through the person without their awareness. This is the structure the blood moon opens. You have been in your own version of catabasis, whether or not you named it. The months that preceded this blood moon, the things pressing on your awareness, the patterns recognized but not resolved, the clarity arriving and retreating before integration, are the approach to the descent. The blood moon did not begin your process. It opened a door that was already there. What ancient initiates had that most people do not is a map. They knew what they were entering. They had been told by those who went before what to expect, what to receive, what not to resist. What this video provides is part of that transmission, not the whole map, but the part that makes the difference between entering the descent consciously and moving through it without a frame for what is happening. What about the person who feels nothing different, who experiences the blood moon as simply an interesting astronomical event? Two things are simultaneously true. First, the neurological mechanisms operate regardless of felt experience. Melatonin production increases with the altered light, whether or not the person perceives any difference. The magnetite crystals register geomagnetic fluctuations, whether or not the person notices the sensitivity. These are physiological events, not dependent on perception of them. Second, the threshold at which these physiological changes reach conscious awareness varies enormously across individuals. The same neurological event that produces a vivid experience of shadow emergence in one person produces a subtle quality of quiet in another and no noticeable effect in a third. The difference is in the sensitivity cultivated through prior practice and the degree of shadow material accumulated awaiting an access window. The conversation about the pineal gland always reaches a threshold where the documented becomes speculative. Cross that threshold clearly. Documented, the pineal gland synthesizes melatonin, responds to specific light conditions, shifts brainwave states toward theta. Speculative but peer-reviewed. The gland may produce endogenous tryptamine compounds under specific physiological conditions. Rick Strassman's clinical research and Cottenham's subsequent work identifying DMT synthesis pathways in rodent pineal tissue raise the question without settling it. Does the human pineal, under specific altered light, altered electromagnetic deep theta conditions that a total lunar eclipse can produce, synthesize compounds that produce qualitative consciousness, shifts beyond what melatonin alone explains? The research is ongoing. The question is legitimate, and ancient traditions, without the vocabulary of tryptamines, may have been empirically tracking this capacity for millennia. Everything described in this video points toward a single convergence: neural mechanism, pineal chemistry, melatonin, theta state, reduced prefrontal gating, shadow access, electromagnetic mechanism, magnetite crystal resonance, geomagnetic field fluctuation, compound biological sensitivity, psychological mechanism, shadow emergence, integration access, the surfacing of the Egyptian duat. Quantum theoretical frame, altered observer state, changed relationship to what is probable. These are not competing explanations. They are four scales of description for a single event that ancient practitioners documented carefully because they discovered empirically that it produced results. The language they used, mystical, cosmological, initiatory, was the available vocabulary. The observation underneath was the same observation that neuroscience, geophysics, and quantum theory are now independently confirming. When independent streams of inquiry converge on the same window, the convergence is the message. Neural, electromagnetic, psychological, quantum. 4 scales, 4 validated or theorized mechanisms, 4 independent lines of evidence. Ancient empirical observation, neurological research, geophysical measurement, quantum theoretical physics, all identifying the same window. The blood moon is not significant because a tradition declared it so. The tradition identified it as significant because it was producing observable, repeatable effects on human consciousness that warranted systematic mapping across civilizations. The science is not validating the tradition by discovering new facts. The science is reaching from the opposite direction, the same observation the tradition made first. 2 distinct methodologies, separated by thousands of years, and the entire arc of modern scientific development describing the same event. When a phenomenon can be approached from that many independent angles and the descriptions converge, when the neuroscientist, the geophysicist, the ancient practitioner, and the quantum theorist are all pointing at the same window, the convergence is the most important data point in the entire analysis. The question that tends to arise here is, if this knowledge is this well documented, why do most people have no meaningful framework for what happens to them during a blood moon? The inversion. The problem is not suppression. The problem is more universal and more subtle than conspiracy. Knowledge transmitted only as form, as ritual, as prescription, as tradition without mechanism, degrades as it moves through cultural disruption. The mystery schools did not disappear because enemies destroyed them. They faded because the transmission of mechanism was severed from the transmission of form. The ritual survived. The understanding of what the ritual was doing neurologically and electromagnetically did not. What you are recovering in this video is not secret knowledge. It is the mechanism that was separated from the form, and reuniting them is what makes the form work. Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who renamed himself Paracelsus, meaning beyond Celsus, as a declaration of independence from classical medical authority, was a 16th-century physician-alchemist credited with founding toxicology and making foundational contributions to pharmacology. He wrote extensively on what he called celestial medicine, the study of how astronomical events, including lunar cycles and eclipses, affect human physiological and psychological states. His contemporaries dismiss this as mysticism, contaminating an otherwise empirical mind. 3 centuries later, what Paracelsus described is being studied under the name chronobiology, the scientific study of biological cycles and their relationship to environmental conditions. He lacked instruments to measure geomagnetic fluctuations. He had something that functioned as a substitute: long, careful observation of what changed in patients during specific astronomical events, recorded with the precision of a clinical mind. The distance between Paracelsus and a modern neuroscientist looks enormous in vocabulary and method. In the underlying observation, it is narrower than it appears. Both are examining the same question: does the human body respond in measurable and predictable ways to conditions that coincide with specific astronomical events? Paracelsus answered yes, based on clinical observation and the theoretical frameworks available in the 16th century. The chronobiologist answers yes, based on controlled studies and instruments capable of measuring what Paracelsus could only observe qualitatively. The answer is the same. If you placed a transcript of Paracelsus's clinical observations about lunar eclipse effects beside a modern researcher's data on melatonin, cortisol, and brainwave changes during eclipse windows, you would find a structural correspondence between what he described qualitatively and what instruments now confirm quantitatively. The vocabulary changed. The human body's behavior during eclipses did not. Is the blood moon the only window that opens these mechanisms, or does the same thing occur during ordinary full moons? Both are legitimate triggers of the pineal melatonin pathway. Full moons do affect melatonin production through the same light sensitivity mechanism, but total lunar eclipses are qualitatively distinct. The spectral composition of light during totality, dominated by red wavelengths, dramatically reduced in intensity, produces a different photosensitive response than ordinary full moon light. The geomagnetic fluctuations during a total lunar eclipse are more pronounced than those of ordinary full moons. The compound effect of multiple simultaneous mechanisms, altered light spectrum, dramatic brightness reduction, and geomagnetic field change, occurs together only during totality. The tradition did not treat all full moons identically. The systematic practices prescribed for lunar eclipses were distinct across every tradition that documented them. The distinction is not arbitrary, it is physiological. Clear the misconception before the close. The blood moon is not delivering a message, it is not communicating through omens. It is not selecting who receives its effects and who does not. It is a physical event, producing specific physical conditions, altered light, geomagnetic shift, that trigger specific biological responses in every human nervous system that encounters them. The effects are universal. The awareness of the effects is individual. The blood moon does not perform the work of transformation. It opens the neurological conditions under which transformation is more accessible than at any other point in the lunar calendar. The work, the sitting in stillness, the receiving of shadow material, the deliberate engagement with what surfaces, is yours. The blood moon opens the room. Whether you walk in is a decision the moon cannot make for you. At the neural scale, pineal chemistry shifts, melatonin rises, theta opens, and the prefrontal filter that manages shadow material temporarily relaxes. What was below the threshold surfaces into accessibility. At the electromagnetic scale, magnetite crystals in your brain tissue register the geomagnetic fluctuations of the eclipse, compounding the neurological sensitivity through a second, independent pathway. At the psychological scale, the shadow material that has accumulated, unprocessed grief, unresolved patterns, the things being managed rather than integrated, rises with unusual clarity into the window that theta opens. At the quantum theoretical scale, if the relationship between the state of consciousness and the collapse of probability is real at the human level, the altered observer state of the blood moon window is also an altered relationship to what is possible in the hours and days that follow. 4 scales, 1 window, already open, already active, already working. The initiates who completed catabasis in the ancient mystery schools were not distinguished by their willingness to descend. They were distinguished by their willingness to come back, to carry what they found in the depth back across the threshold into ordinary life. The descent without the return produces nothing usable. What ancient traditions understood about the blood moon is not that the window itself is the transformation. The window is the access. Transformation requires that what is accessed during the window is carried back and integrated into the daily structure of consciousness. The blood moon opens what is normally closed. The integration that follows is what changes things. People who work these windows consistently across months and years accumulate something that people who sleep through them do not. Not mystical power, but processed experience and a steadily reducing store of shadow material operating without their awareness. What do you do with everything this video has described? The answer is not complicated. Sit with what has surfaced tonight, not to resolve it, not to explain it immediately, but to receive it. Write down what arrived. The writing is the anchor, shadow material that surfaces during a blood moon window and is not recorded, tends to slip back below the threshold when the window closes, leaving only residue of anxiety without the insight that accompanied it. Note the specific content, not the feeling but the thought, the image, the memory, the clarity that cut through. If something in you has recognized a pattern you've been managing rather than integrating, this is the moment to name it. Not to fix it, to name it. The naming is the first act of catabasis. Everything the ancient traditions described as transformation begins in the small, precise act of turning toward what has surfaced and saying, "I see this." Stop scrolling, close the unnecessary tabs. If you are in the blood moon window right now, the mechanisms described in this video are active in your nervous system. The pineal gland has been responding, the magnetite crystals have been registering, the theta state has been open, shadow material has been surfacing. Ancient seers tracked this window across civilizations. Modern neuroscientists are documenting the mechanisms. Geophysicists are measuring the field changes. Quantum theorists are debating the implications for consciousness and probability. All of these independent lines of inquiry are pointing in the same direction. At this window, at this moment, at the state you are already in. The gap between those who use these windows and those who sleep through them is not talent, not development, not luck. It is a single decision. The decision to be conscious of what is already happening. That decision is available to you right now. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I'm in the window," and I've placed another lesson on your screen right now to take you one step deeper into this work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.